The record even the king could not see. There was a king, a figure of absolute power. His word decided the life and death of his subjects. He stood above the law. No one could give him orders. And yet in his kingdom, there existed one thing, just one, that even he could never see. What the king said today, the expression on his face during a council meeting, how long he hesitated before making a decision, why he lost his temper at a minister. Even the moments when he was wrong, all of it was recorded, and none of it could be read while the king was still alive. The kingdom that built this strange system was Joseon, the Korean dynasty that lasted 500 years. Today we tell the story of one of the most remarkable historical records in the world, the Joseon Royal Annals. Chapter 1, the people who recorded the kings every day. Joseon had a distinctive profession, the sagwan, or royal historian. These were not simple clerks. They were people whose job was to record the king's daily activities in real time. When the king held a royal audience with his ministers, a sagwan was in the room. Whatever policy was decided, whatever report was received, whatever the king said, the sagwan's brush never stopped. The sagwan produced two kinds of records. The sijonggi was the official log of state affairs and meetings. The sacho was the sagwan's personal record freer in form and containing things that the official log could not easily capture: the king's expression, the atmosphere in the hall, the glances exchanged between ministers, and the historian's own assessment. The sagwan held ranks between junior 7th and 9th grade, relatively low in the Joseon bureaucracy. Yet regardless of rank, their records were untouchable even by the king. Low in status, enormous in authority. Could the king never see these records? In principle, no. The sagwan's records were not reported to the king. The moment a recorder could be seen by the ruler, the recorder would begin watching the ruler's face. And the moment that happened, the truth would disappear. Joseon turned this simple principle into an institution. In practice, there were kings who tried to read the records or pressure the historians. That too is part of history, and the Sillok records those attempts as well. From the annals, the Taejong Sillok records that Taejong fell from his horse and then ordered that this incident not be recorded by the court historians. The fact that he gave that order was recorded in the Sillok. The command to erase something became the thing that preserved it. This is the essence of the sagwan system. Historians who recorded even the king's order not to record. Chapter 2, a system to check power. Joseon was a state founded on Confucian principles. In Confucian thought, the king is not an absolute being. He is a figure entrusted with heaven's mandate to govern the people, and his rule must conform to moral standards. It followed naturally from this philosophy that the king's actions should be recorded and evaluated by posterity. The king, too, was placed in a position of accountability before history. Power is judged by the record. This was the philosophical foundation of Joseon's sagwan institution. Not swords or armies, but brushes and documents were the instruments of accountability. Knowing that unfavorable things would be recorded was itself a form of constraint on a king's behavior. Being watched by eyes you cannot fully control is different from believing you are entirely unseen. The process of compiling the Sillok reflected this spirit. When a king died, the next king's court established a temporary body called the Sillok, the Annals Office. This office gathered the sagwan sacho records, the Seongjongwon ilgi, the daily records of the royal secretariat, and various official reports, then organized and compiled them into the final Sillok. When finished, the Sillok was printed in multiple copies and distributed to archives called sago in different parts of the country. If one burned, if one was looted, the others would remain. The institutional design reflected an obsession with keeping the record alive. From the annals, the Joseon Royal Annals covers 25 reigns and 472 years of history, from King Taejong to King Taejong. In terms of physical volume, the Jeongjoksan archive version alone runs to 1,187 books. In 1997, the annals were inscribed on UNESCO's Memory of the World Register. Chapter 3, How the Sillok was made. The sacho written daily by the sagwan were not made public immediately. These records only became a single compiled work after the king's death. That compiled work is the Sillok. The compilation process went through multiple stages. The sagwan's personal sacho were collected, cross-referenced with the Seongjongwon ilgi and other official records, and organized into successive drafts. The initial draft, the intermediate draft, and the final draft. Once the final Sillok was complete, the original sacho were no longer needed. And so Joseon performed a distinctive ritual. Sacho, washing away the drafts. The original documents were physically washed in water and destroyed. Sacho was not simply discarding paper. It was a declaration these records have now been absorbed into the final Sillok, and no one may ever examine or misuse the originals. It was simultaneously a way to protect the historians and to preserve the integrity of the record. After the washing ceremony, the historians would make a pulp of the paper and release it into a stream running through the government compound. Only when that ritual was complete was the compilation of the Sillok considered finished. One more principle governed the completed Sillok once finished. It could never be revised. Even if the king found the contents objectionable, even if ministers raised objections, the content of a compiled Sillok could not be changed. It must be said there are historical cases where Sillok were revised or recompiled during periods of political upheaval. The revision of the Yeonsangun Ilgi after the Yeonjong coup is the most prominent example. But these were recognized as exceptions, violations of principle, and those violations were themselves recorded. Note the records of Yeonsangun and Gwanghaegun are called Ilgi diaries rather than Sillok annals. This was deliberate. Both were deposed kings, and the use of Ilgi instead of Sillok was a way of marking them as rulers whose legitimacy was not fully recognized. Chapter 4, A King Who Feared the Record, Yeonsangun. Not every king accepted this system. Some found it deeply uncomfortable to know that a historian's brush was pointed at them at all times. The most extreme case is Yeonsangun. In 1498, Yeonsangun triggered the Muosawa, the literati purge of 1498. On the surface, the cause was that the court historian Kim Il-sung had included his teacher Kim Jong-jik's essay, Dirge for the Duke of Yi, in his sacho. The essay was a veiled critique of King Sejo's seizure of the throne from the young King Taejong. Yeonsangun declared it treasonous writing that defamed the royal house and carried out a mass purge of the Sarim faction, scholars connected to it. The crucial point, the contents of a sacho became the cause of a political purge. Yeonsangun had read private historical records that, by principle, a living king should never see. This was a severe violation of the institution's core principle. From the annals, dozens of people were executed or exiled in the Muosawa. Kim Jong-jik, already dead, was subjected to desecration of his grave, exhuming a corpse to administer punishment posthumously. The Sillok records this as a direct consequence of a sitting king reading the sacho. But Yeonsangun's suppression of records did not stop there. In the Gapja Sawa of 1504, the scale expanded further. Having learned that records remained of the circumstances surrounding the death of his mother, the deposed Queen Yun, Yeonsangun executed everyone connected to those events. He went further still. He imposed restrictions on what the sagwan could record and held some meetings without historians present at all. He was trying to dismantle the recording system itself. What was the outcome? In 1506, Yeonsangun was deposed in the Yeonjong coup. The king who had stood at the apex of power, the king who had made the most violent attempt to control the record, became one of the most harshly evaluated rulers in all of Korean history. Every act of Yeonsangun's that tried to erase the record ended up being recorded in more detail. The attempt to suppress the record preserved that attempt in the record. The Sillok outlasted the king who tried to stop it. Chapter 5, A Record Kept at the Cost of Lives. The Imjin War. 1592, the Imjin War began. Japanese forces swept through the peninsula with devastating speed. The capital fell. King Seonjo fled north. In this chaos, 200 years of Joseon's accumulated records faced destruction. At that time, the Sillok was stored in 4 archives across the country: the Chuncheon in the capital Hanyang, the Cheongju Archive in Chungcheong Province, the Seongju Archive in Gyeongsang Province, and the Jeonju Archive in Jeolla Province. This 4-archive system had been completed during the reign of King Taejong. As the war progressed, 3 of the 4 archives burned. The Chuncheon, Cheongju, and Seongju archives and the Sillok copies they contained became ash. Only the Jeonju archive remained. But Japanese forces were continuing to move south. Jeonju was not safe. At this moment, 2 men stepped forward in Yui in Sun Hongrak. On the 22nd day of the 6th month of 1592, an Ui, then 64 years old, in Sun Hongrak, then 56 years old, loaded the Sillok from the Jeonju archive, along with the royal portrait of King Taejong, onto more than 30 oxen and horses, and set out for Naijangsan Mountain in Jeongup. They were ordinary Confucian scholars with no official position. The Sillok alone comprised 784 volumes and 614 books across 47 cases. After moving the Sillok deep into Naijangsan, the 2 men did not leave. For more than a year, they stood alternate watch over the records. When Japanese forces came near, They moved deeper into the mountain, first to Yunbangam, then to the even more remote Birium. The account of their actions survives in a document, and Ui wrote himself the Imgigisa, meaning Record of the Yearsum, and Guy, 1592 and 1593. This document was preserved by Inui's descendants for generations, and came to public knowledge in 2011 when a descendant donated it to the Jeongup City Museum. In 1593, an Uayan son Hongrok handed the Sillok over to the Joseon government after more than a year of guardianship. The records were moved during the war to Myeongsan and Gangwon Island and eventually survived. After the war, Joseon used the sole surviving Jeonju copy to reprint the Sillok in 4 additional sets. And this time the archives were placed deep in the mountains Taebeksan, Odasan, Myeongsan, Gangwa's Manasan. Never again would the Sillok be kept somewhere easy to reach. And we died in 1596 having confirmed that the Sillok was safe. Son Hongrok lived until around 1600, long enough to see the aftermath of the war begin to settle. Neither man received high office or lasting fame for what they did. But without the year they spent standing alternate watch in the mountains of Nejingsan, we would know nothing of the first 200 years of Joseon history. Chapter 6. Compared to the world, why the Sillok is exceptional. Other countries kept records too. China had the Ming Shilu. Japan had its imperial records. So what made the Joseon Royal Annals different? First, it is the only surviving original from its royal period. The Chinese Ming Shilu runs to approximately 2,900 volumes, larger in unit count, but what survives today are all copies made in the modern era. Japan's comparable records have also lost their originals. The Joseon Royal Annals is the only Sillok-type record in the world for which originals produced during the dynasty itself have survived intact. Second, Joseon was the only country that actually upheld the principle that no subsequent king could read the Sillok. China and Japan also compiled royal annals. But the principle that later kings could not view the completed record was a principle only Joseon maintained in practice. This is why the Joseon Royal Annals contains relatively little deliberate distortion or selective omission, and why historians today regard it as one of the most reliable dynastic records in the world. Third, the annals recorded things that were unfavorable to the king. Most royal records in history were written to celebrate the ruler's achievements, or at minimum to justify them from the ruler's perspective. The Joseon Royal Annals is different. It contains the king's mistakes, misjudgments, ministers' criticisms, and the king's own contradictions. This is why historians today consider the Joseon Royal Annals among the most credible historical records of any pre-modern dynasty. The Joseon Royal Annals was inscribed on UNESCO's Memory of the World Register in 1997. Alongside the Hunminjeongeum, the document describing the creation of the Korean alphabet. Today, the annals have been fully digitized and are freely accessible to anyone online, with both original text and modern Korean translation available. Ending, the record remains. If a king knew that his every action was being recorded, what choices would he make? The kings of Joseon always knew that someone was watching, that the historian's brush never stopped, that the record would outlast them and be judged by those who came after. That knowledge did not make them perfect rulers. Taejong ordered that his fall from a horse not be recorded. Yeonsangun read the sacho and executed ministers, but every one of those acts, including the orders to erase, ended up in the Sillok. In the summer of 1582, as war consumed the country, 2 old men loaded books onto oxen and horses and walked into the mountains. No one had ordered them to go. They went because they believed this record must not be allowed to disappear. The books that An Ui and Sun Hongrok guarded through alternating watches on Naejungsan Mountain are the foundation on which we can tell the story of Joseon today. Power does not last forever. Dynasties end, but records remain. Shun believed there was something stronger than the sword, something that outlasted power. The record.